Hello everyone. My name is Swetha, currently pursuing fourth semesters in Masters in Construction Engineering and Management at CEPT University. Today, I'll be presenting my directed research project titled Researching Statutory Approval Procedures Across Different Real Estate Development Typologies. This research was conducted during the spring semester 2026 by the guidance of Mr. Lokeshwar Kapoor. This presentation will take us through a comprehensive analysis of how the statutory approvals work differently across various types of real estate developments in India, with a particular focus on the Hyderabad metropolitan region. The real estate sector in India is incredibly complex and one of the biggest challenges developers face in navigating the maze of statutory approvals required for different development typologies. This research aims to shed light on these processes and propose solutions for making them more efficient. The real estate sector is one of the major contributors to India's economy and is also one of the largest employment generators after agriculture. Rapid urbanization, increasing investment, and large scale infrastructure growth have expanded the sector significantly. However, this growth has also increased the complexity of statutory approvals required for development projects. Statutory approvals are formal permissions issued by various government authorities to ensure that a project complies with planning regulations, environmental norms, infrastructure standards, and safety requirements. The approval process generally moves from land related permissions and planning clearances to construction approvals and finally post construction certifications. One of the major issues in the approval system is the involvement of multiple authorities. Like different departments handle different approvals, making the process highly fragmented and coordination intensive. Another issue recorded is the sequential nature of the approval system, where delays in one stage directly affect subsequent stages. Limited coordination between departments also result in repetitive documentation and procedural inefficiencies. Although digital systems and online portals have improved accessibility and transparency, they have not fully solved the issue of approval efficiency. This slide also highlights the role of RERA, the Real Estate Regulation Authority, in improving transparency, accountability, financial security, and quality assurance in the real estate sector. While RERA strengthens the governance and protects the stakeholders, it has limited influence on simplifying the actual approval procedure between departments. The importance of approvals is another major aspect discussed here. Approvals are essential for ensuring regulatory compliance, project monitoring, stakeholder protection, and sustainable urban development. They act as critical checkpoints that determine whether a project is legally and technically feasible. The research identifies several major issues within the current approvals ecosystem, including fragmented authority systems, inefficient process structures, lack of coordination, sequential dependency of approvals, absence of process based understanding, and lack of early feasibility integration. Based on these issues, the study aims to develop a structured understanding of statutory approvals, create a streamlined framework for evaluating approval procedures. The objectives include identifying statutory approvals, analyzing authority roles, mapping and comparing approval process, evaluating timeline and risk impacts, and proposing a more systematic framework for approvals. The slide presents a literature study and establishes the theoretical and regulatory understanding required for the research. The approval process in real estate development is generally divided into three major phases. The pre-construction phase that includes land zoning, planning permissions, environmental clearances, and fire safety approvals that determine whether the project is legally feasible before the development begins. Construction phase includes commencement certificates, inspections that actually ensure that the project is executed according to the approved plans and norms. The post-construction phase involves occupancy certificates, completion approvals, and utility connections that actually confirm whether the building is safe and it's ready for occupation. The study also examines how approval delays affect projects. Delays are caused by fragmented authority systems, procedural complexity, and lack of coordination. These delays not only affect the project timelines but also increase the project costs. The literature review categorizes real estate developments into residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, and planned developments across small, medium, and large scales. The study identifies that approval complexity increases not only with the project scale but also with the level of coordination that is required between the agencies. Like larger projects involve strict compliance systems, multi-agency coordination, and more regulatory checkpoints. The slide further explains that the multi-level regulatory that structures the governing real estate development in India. At the central level, we have regulations that includes RERA, environmental laws, CIZ notifications, and the airport authority restrictions. At the state level, we can see that regulations involve development authorities, master plans, and floor space index norms. While the city level regulations include land zoning, building setbacks, parking norms, and development controls. The study also reviews recent digital reforms such as the national single window system, business reform actions, and the online approval platforms, which aim to simplify the approval process. However, the literature identifies several research gaps. Existing studies lack comparative analysis across different development typologies, timeline based evaluation, process based understanding, and practical guidance for the developers. There is also no uniform framework available for streamlining these approvals. These gaps form the foundation and justification for this research. This slide introduces Hyderabad as the primary case study for the research and explains the city's evolving regulatory framework. Hyderabad has experienced rapid urbanization and large scale metropolitan expansion over the last decade. This growth has increased the complexity of planning and approval systems, making the city an appropriate case study for understanding the statutory approval procedures. The research highlights how institutional reforms have transformed these urban governance in Hyderabad. New governance bodies which have been introduced, planning jurisdictions that have expanded, and there has been a shift towards integrated governance systems to manage this metropolitan development more effectively. The study also highlights that infrastructure and environmental conditions significantly influence the statutory approvals in Hyderabad. Hyderabad was selected for the research because of its rapid urban growth, strong real estate activity, metropolitan planning structure, and integrated urban governance systems. This slide introduces the major regulatory bodies involved in the approval process in Hyderabad. TSB PASS digitizes building approvals and provides online processing with defined timelines, and it works majorly for the building developments. Whereas the Telangana state RERA regulates the project registration, escrow compliance, and grievance redressal mechanisms. The Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority is responsible for the metropolitan planning, zoning regulations, and the layout approvals. The Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation handles municipal governance, building permissions, tax administration, and enforcement functions. In addition to these, there are specialized agencies such as fire services, pollution control boards, airport authorities, and environmental departments that issue conditional approvals depending on the requirement of that particular project. The final section explains that these approval systems differ across different development typologies such as residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, and planned developments. While the broader research studies multiple typologies, this presentation mainly focuses on industrial developments, which sets an example for the building approvals, and plotted developments as an example of layout approvals. This comparison helps understand how these approval structures differ depending upon their nature of the development. This slide explains the approval structure for industrial developments and demonstrates how industrial approvals are highly operational and risk sensitive in nature. Industrial projects require multiple approvals depending on the site conditions, environmental sensitivity, infrastructure proximity, and operational risks. The approval system involves several authorities, each responsible for a specific regulatory requirement. Projects located near railways, highways, metro corridors, and water channels, defense lands, heritage structures, or protected monuments require separate NOCs from the relevant departments. These approvals are necessary to ensure that industrial activities do not interfere with the transportation infrastructure or the environmental systems or any heritage protection zones. Process also includes approvals related to hazardous materials and industrial safety. For example, approvals from the Petroleum and Explosive Authority are required when projects are located near any gas stations or installations. Environmental and safety related clearances become very important in industrial developments because these projects involve operational risks beyond the conventional body building construction. The slide also highlights that approvals required during construction include the labor license, commencement certificate, and technical installation approvals such as the lift operation permits. Post-construction approvals include the fire safety inspections and occupancy or the completion certificates before the operations can actually begin. One of the major observations from this analysis is that industrial approvals differ majorly from one development to the other. Industrial projects are not governed only by the planning and construction regulations, but they're also governed by the operational safety, environmental compliance, and technical feasibility requirements. As a result, industrial approval systems are very complex, process intensive, risk sensitive, and coordination dependent, when compared to the conventional real estate developments. Plotted development approval process. This slide explains the approval structure for the planned developments and highlights how these projects are primarily driven by land legality, planning compliance, and different layout approvals. The process begins with title verification and encumbrance checks to confirm legal ownership and identify any problems or challenges associated with that particular land. The next stage would be the land conversion, where agricultural land is converted into non agricultural land and different commercial lands are converted into residential lands. This is a critical requirement because the project cannot legally proceed further without this conversion permit. Zoning compliance is another important step as it ensures that the project development aligns with the master plan and regulations that are established by the HMDA. The most critical stage in plotted development approvals is the layout approval. This process governs subdivision planning, infrastructure provision, road networks, open spaces, and any other planning regulations. Since it directly determines whether the project can move further or not, it acts as the primary challenge within the approval system itself. The approval structure also includes supporting permissions that are related to road access, open space reservation, drainage infrastructure, and environmental clearances. The process further involves departmental NOCs, which requires the coordination between multiple agencies. Delays often occur due to these interdepartmental dependency and sequential processing systems. Another important mechanism which is highlighted in this particular slide is the mortgage of land to the HMDA before sale permissions are granted. This acts as a regulatory enforcement mechanism to ensure that compliance with approved conditions of the development. Final stage is plot registration, where ownership is legally transferred to the buyers through the registrar's office. The key conclusion from this analysis would be that plotted developments involve fewer approvals when compared to the other different development typologies. Each approval carries much greater strategic importance because it directly affects the project viability, legality, and the planning compliance. This demonstrates that early stage planning approvals are very critical in determining the success and viability of plotted development. Comparative analysis. This slide compares the approval requirements and approval flow across different real estate development typologies, including the residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, and the planned or plotted developments. The table categorizes approvals into land and legal, water and site feasibility, planning, environmental, building, and construction. The highlighted sections represent approvals that are particularly important or dominant for the specific typologies. Under land and legal approvals, title due diligence, land conversion, land use certificates, and zoning conformity are one of the common across all the different development typologies. However, in plotted developments, land conversion becomes a very important stage because the entire layout approval process is dependent on it. Under water and site feasibility, the FTL and buffer verification is marked critical across all typologies because it directly affects the site viability. Irrigation NOCs and drainage clearances are conditional or required depending on the site conditions, but they become very important in industrial developments due to the higher infrastructure and environmental impact. In the planning stage, layout approval is very important across all the typologies, but it becomes the core approval in the planned developments. This is because plotted projects are primarily governed through the layout planning compliance rather than the building permissions. Environmental clearance is another important stage. It is conditional for plotted developments depending on scale. It is mandatory for large residential developments, but highly important for industrial projects because of the industrial approvals that are strongly linked with the pollution and environmental norms. In building and construction approvals, building permission and fire NOC are required for all buildings based on the developments. However, these are not applicable for plotted developments because there are no immediate building structures that are involved in the approval stage. The slide also compares approval flows. Industrial developments follow a parallel approval process but are controlled by the environmental clearance and regulatory norms. Plotted developments follow a more linear and front-loaded process where layout approvals acts as the primary challenge. The key takeaway from this particular slide would be that the approval complexity is not determined by how many number of approvals are there in that particular development, but by the approvals that control the entire project progression. Different typologies have different dependency structures, and these structures directly affect the coordination requirements and project delays. This slide focuses on the authorities involved in the approval process and identifies the major challenges across different development typologies. The table right here compares the role of planning authorities, revenue departments, environmental agencies, utility departments, and other sector specific authorities across these different development typologies. The planning authority has a core role across all typologies, but it becomes the most important authority in the plan developments because of its importance in the layout compliances. Environmental authorities such as the SCIA and pollution control boards become very important in industrial developments due to their major environmental impact. The fire department requirements become more strict in commercial and institutional projects, and they are very highly risk sensitive in the industrial development. Utilities, irrigation departments, and the HMDA full tank level verification and municipal engineering departments are very important across most typologies because they influence the infrastructure viability and the compliance. Institutional development, such as additional sector specific authorities, because schools, hospitals, and public institutions require approvals from these specialized departments. Industrial developments involve the highest number of authorities, including the factories department, industries department, petroleum and explosive. Plotted developments in comparison involve very limited departmental authorities because the approval process is mainly focused on the layout compliance. The highlighted insight summarizes that the dominant regulatory pattern in each typology. Plotted developments are controlled primarily through layout approval. Residential and commercial developments are dependent on the multi-stage approvals, and these industrial projects are very dominant by environmental and regulatory challenges. The slide also identifies major challenges in the approval system. One of the challenges is the dominant approvals acting as control points, where these delays in a single approval affect the entire process. Another is the sequential processing of these interdependent approvals. These inefficiencies directly impact the project delivery by causing delays in timelines, increasing the project costs, and reducing the planning predictability. Overall, this slide demonstrates that the approval complexity increases not only with the number of approvals, but also with the number and nature of authorities involved and the coordination required between those authorities. Streamlining framework. This slide explains the major issues in the current approval systems, the need for streamlining the process, and the proposed integrated digital approval framework. The key issues identified include concentration of critical approvals, repetition in documentation and verification, lack of parallel processing, and overlaps between these authorities. These issues create inefficiencies because multiple departments often ask for similar information independently, increasing the redundancy and the rework. The need for streamlining arises mainly due to authority fragmentation, poor coordination efficiency, timeline risks, and it is very important for a standardized approval mechanism. To address these issues, the proposed framework focuses on three major improvements. One, the first would be classification of approvals based on their roles and dependencies, which kind of helps differentiate these approvals that must remain sequential and which must remain parallel. The second is the reduction of idle time between these stages through the parallel processing. The third is improved coordination across authorities using a shared single digital system. The slide also highlights implementation challenges such as interagency coordination issues, lack of data standardization, institutional resistance, and technical infrastructure limitations. Despite these challenges, the framework is expected to improve the approval timelines through early stage efficiency, mid stage compression of timelines, reduced rework, and faster decision making. The integrated digital system forms the core of the proposed solution. The core concept is a single application platform where the project information is submitted at once and it automatically routes to the relevant authorities. The key advantages include reduced approval timelines, improved coordination between the authorities, and transparency improvement through the live approval tracking. The table here explains the key components of the integrated system. The single window application interface creates a unified submission platform. Real-time dashboards improve visibility and reduce the follow-up requirements. Time-bound approval mechanisms improve accountability. Overall, this slide presents streamlining as a process, restructuring the exercise rather than only as a technological upgrade. Parallel approval mechanism. This slide explains the proposed process mapping framework and the logic behind the parallel approval mechanism. The introduction highlights that the current approval system suffers from fragmented authorities, sequential dependencies, and poor coordination, resulting in delays, repeated rework. First principle of this mechanism is the foundational feasibility gatekeeping. Approvals related to land verification, zoning compliance, land conversion, and other approvals must be completed first because they determine whether the project is fundamentally feasible or not. The second principle is a simultaneous processing of independent approvals. Approvals that do not depend on each other should be processed parallelly to reduce the unnecessary delays. The third principle is independence of external approvals from the internal sequencing. The final principle is context driven. Like different project typologies require different approval structures and coordination methods. The table here maps the approval process into 5 different stages. Stage 1 is the foundational stage involving the land verification, zoning compliance, layout approvals, and environmental clearances if applicable. Stage 2 is the unified submission stage, which involves the single window application submission and document upload. Stage 3 is the parallel processing stage, which combines the parallel and partially sequential approvals, such as utility approvals or different departmental NOCs. This stage is highlighted as the core improvement because it compresses the timelines by allowing this parallel approval processing. Stage 4 is the consolidation stage where the final permissions, such as the building permission or the layout clearance, are issued. Stage 5 is the post approval stage involving occupancy certificates, compliance verification, and construction monitoring. The workflow representation analyzes the streamlined flow structure. Like foundational approvals remain sequential because they determine the feasibility. Once this feasibility is confirmed, the integrated submission automatically routes. Parallel approvals are then processed parallelly before the final consolidation stage and then the post approval compliance stage. The key conclusion from this slide is that although all development typologies follow the same 5 step framework, the importance and complexity of each stage differs depending on that particular project development. Conclusions. This slide summarizes the overall findings, contributions, and practical implications of the research. The study investigated how the statutory approvals process vary across different development typologies. And the core finding is that approval complexity is defined more by structure, sequence, and the dependencies and interdependencies rather than simply by the number of approvals counted. The research addresses an important gap between previous frameworks focused mainly on listing approvals instead of analyzing how these approvals interact with each other and affect the project timelines. Primary validation through expert interviews confirmed that several practical challenges, including the redundant documentation, poor interdepartmental coordinations, and the dependency driving the delays of the project. Based on these findings, the proposed framework introduces a typology responsive model that differs between the parallel and the sequential approvals. The slide also explains why this particular framework works. First, it maps interdependencies and identifies the approvals at the foundation level that control the later stages. Second, it clarifies approval sequencing by distinguishing approvals that must remain sequential from those that can also be parallelized. Third, the framework is adaptive across typologies because the same 5 stage structure applies to all the developments, while complexity varies between different stages of those developments. Fourth, the framework acts as a decision making tool rather than only a checklist by helping the developers prioritize approvals, coordinate process, and plan activities effectively and accordingly. Practical implementations are highlighted for different stakeholders. Like for developers, it benefits through improved scheduling and fewer avoidable delays. Consultants could benefit through better documentation and submission strategies, and regulators could benefit by identifying the challenges at an early stage. The slide also identifies the future research opportunities that includes broader stakeholder surveys, cross city and state approval comparisons, and evaluation of digital approval systems. The final conclusion emphasizes that inefficiencies in statutory approvals arise only from process structures and coordination gaps rather than the regulatory compliances alone. The proposed framework, therefore, bridges the gap between policy theory and practical project delivery.